Hello, welcome everyone to the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network and the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflicts Peace and Conflict Higher Education webinar series. For those of you who are interested, we have a full list that will be occurring this spring on the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network webpage. And if you click on the right-hand side up at the top under resources, you'll be able to register for the additional webinars in the series. In fact, we have another one tomorrow. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next presenter in the series, which is Steve Chase from the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. He'll be sharing with us more about how to integrate the topic of nonviolence into our courses in higher ed. Before Steve shares more with us about that, I want to thank our sponsors, the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, for helping to support this series and for the development of the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network. So in Ohio, we have about 52 colleges and universities, four-year universities, colleges and universities plus, and most of those have either a certificate, degree, or concentration, or a department that focuses on conflict resolution or peace building. And so this network is a group of voluntary faculty, staff, and administrators from most of those colleges and universities who are working to help support and advance this work in the field and in their organizations and across our state. So we also work with partners like the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and we want to thank the ICNC for being willing to be a partner for many years, helping to support the growth of integration of nonviolence into our courses across the state of Ohio and beyond, and for presenting at our international conferences on conflict resolution. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here, and Steve, our presenter, will take it away and tell you a little bit more about ICNC and his work. Thank you. As Steve brings up his PowerPoint, I will share that we will have a time for Q&A for questions and answers as soon as Steve is finished. Steve's going to present for about 30 minutes, and then he will we'll take some questions and answers, and I'll help facilitate that. So thanks so much. Steve?
All right, thank you so much, Jen. Welcome everybody. I'm really happy to be here focusing on making what I call peace studies whole, or peace and conflict studies whole, by adding civil resistance to the mix. And as Jen said, I'm the manager of academic initiatives at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. And we have a particular focus of our work as an educational philanthropy. Let's see, just need to, there we go. So the ICNC focuses on how ordinary people wage nonviolent conflict to win rights, freedom, and justice, and other goals like sustainability, where social movements are activated voluntarily, and they're using the tools of nonviolent conflict to win struggles against undemocratic elites who are blocking progress and goals that would help the public good. And now, but one thing I have noticed over time is that people often look at our tagline, "Oh, we're focused on nonviolent action," and when they think about it, they tend to think about diplomacy, dialogue, negotiations, collaborative decision-making, all of which are hugely important strategies for winning what we could call a just peace, and moving things forward and helping to resolve conflicts. But it came to me that sometimes that's the exclusive way that people think about it. And I recently had in the office about 12 UN fellows from the Mideast and North Africa, and they're the person who was leading them for the visit, and we were in the conference room, said, "So Steve, could you tell us about the role of women in peace building and conflict prevention?" And I had to laugh and I had to refocus them a bit that given ICNC's role, peace building skills are hugely important. Conflict prevention can be really important, but I told them that we're focused on studying how people actually engage in conflict in the most creative and effective way possible. And I handed them a report that we had created called Powering to Peace, that talks about both civil resistance and peace building. And so you now can see the copy of that report from ICNC and a graphic from it, which looks at the broader field of what the author was talking about in conflict transformation, which peace building and civil resistance exist within that broader field. And I think we could also look at conflict transformation as peace and conflict studies as the broader field that includes attention on peace building and civil resistance. And it's a Venn diagram that the civil resistance is not typically used without any skills of peace building. Peace building often has practical applications of being used as part of building negotiations after power has shifted. The power balance has shifted because of civil resistance. And so I would just encourage anybody who's in a peace studies program to sort of look at their program and see if both dimensions of peace building and civil resistance are included in a robust way, as well as the integration that this special report is talking about. And so if you're in a situation where you're in higher education, your programs are mostly focused on peace building with diplomacy, negotiations, various kinds of dialogue and collaboration, but they don't focus on how do people creatively wage conflict and do that in a way that can be different from armed conflict, and be effective. This will be helpful. So today's workshop outline is that I want us to look more closely at civil resistance movements. And then I think part of it is why this matters so much is that there's been some recent research that has really been able to find that the record of civil resistance is pretty significant in its positive effectiveness and its comparative greater effectiveness than armed conflict and armed struggle to end oppressive power situations. And then I want to focus at the end on resources that ICNC can make available. They're not the only resources available for faculty and students who are thinking seriously about expanding the program in civil resistance, and we can mention some others too, but I wanted to focus most on what I know. So that's the basic outline of today. So the first one is looking at civil resistance movements more closely. And so I always think it's helpful to define the terms. And this is taken from the report that I showed the UN fellows on Powering to Peace, on the integration of civil resistance. And this is her definition, Veronique Dudouet. And I think it's a really good one. I mean, it's wordy, it's a little academic, but I think for our purposes, it's really useful. So let's just walk through it before we go on. Civil resistance is an extra-institutional conflict waging strategy. And let's just look at that part. Extra-institutional means that it's sort of above and beyond traditional normal channels of democratic change through elections and lobbying, lawsuits, litigation, and various kinds of sort of institutionalized practices. And Gandhi once said, if you have those levers available to you in the society that you're in, you should certainly use them. But up against British imperialism, those normal channels of institutional change weren't available. And so he chose a conflict waging strategy that and some people have often in more democratic settings where there was still structural violence and oppression and change needed, have used civil resistance as a supplement to normal institutional channels. But it's important to make the distinction that while it can be combined with normal institutional channels of change, it's not exactly the same thing. And it's a conflict waging strategy in which organized grassroots movements use various strategically sequenced and planned out nonviolent tactics such as strikes, boycotts, marches, demonstrations, various forms of non-cooperation, and also self-organizing and constructive resistance, building of alternative institutions to fight perceived injustice without the threat or use of violence. So this is a mode of struggle with a high level of nonviolent discipline among the movement. And so it's predominantly a nonviolent form of struggle. And so that makes it distinct not only from normal institutional channels, but certainly terrorism or armed struggle and guerrilla warfare. So keeping that in mind, we can think of many cases where this mode of conflict has been used by a wide variety of groups. And the one thing I would say to overcome misconceptions is a friend of mine, George Lakey, once said, I think as far back as 1973, that most pacifists have never engaged in civil resistance. And most people who engage in civil resistance aren't pacifists. So it's a strategic choice that, you know, there may be ethical motivations of preference for using nonviolence, but it's also a sense that this is how we could win rights, freedom, or justice. Gandhi coined the term. This is a letter he wrote in a publication in 1935, where he talks about the evolution of how he talked about satyagraha, which is how he denoted the struggle in Hindi. And he was trying to figure out ways to communicate to an English-speaking language. And he didn't like passive resistance because there's nothing passive about civil resistance. And so for a while, he was inspired to use civil disobedience, a term he read about Thoreau, but he felt that that was still incomplete. And ultimately, he adopted the phrase civil resistance as the English translation for what he had called the satyagraha, is the strategy of struggle used in the Indian independence campaign. Now, a lot of times people look at Gandhi as, you know, he was all about negotiations, and he certainly found a place for them, but he was a militant civil resistance leader. And so I've taken 3 quotes from Gandhi that were quoted in this book, Gandhi as a Political Strategist, by Gene Sharp, who is one of the foremost and early thinkers of nonviolent resistance or civil resistance as a real technique of conflict and struggle that can supplement whenever normal channels of change are either missing or are rigged and necessary but not sufficient, and as an alternative to armed conflict. So I think you can read it, the English nation responds only to force. I used to be a believer in the politics of petitions, deputations, friendly negotiations, but he found in this situation there really needed to be a struggle. He even says, sedition has become my religion, ours is a nonviolent battle. And he talks about how in this situation, it's not just a matter of carrying conviction by argument, that isn't sufficient against British imperialism. And so the matter resolves itself into one of matching forces, but rather than a sort of a traditional, conventional, violent response, anti-colonial movement, he started really experimenting with the possibility of civil resistance. I mentioned Gene Sharp, who wrote the book, Gandhi as a Political Strategist. This is a 3-volume book that he published in '73 that many people might be familiar with, but it was sort of the first really in-depth, systematic look at what we now call civil resistance. And he talks about the theory of power and struggle. He listed over 198 different methods of nonviolent struggle that, looking at case studies, he had found and identified. And then he talked a lot about the dynamics of how it works, how it can lead to victory through mass participation, creative strategic use and sequencing of the methods or the tactics of nonviolent action, of ways of sort of creating backfire in the repressive dynamics that a government might use through escalating nonviolent resistance in the face of repression, and how to encourage loyalty shifts and even defections from regimes, sort of the pillars of support of a regime. And there's been an explosion of research in civil resistance that many peace studies programs are utilizing, but if yours doesn't, it's helpful to know that this exists, because many people around the world have been using these methods since Gandhi's early experiments in anti-colonial struggle. So I'm just going to give some examples, and I'm not going to describe them in detail. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if people want to. But the 10 years before the Revolutionary War, what's sort of not fully appreciated is it was a 10-year campaign of civil resistance to the British, and it was used to powerful effect. And then other examples in the US, women's suffrage was a civil resistance struggle because women didn't have the right to vote, so they had to find other tactics to use to win that right. The labor movement is an example that's used civil resistance strategies to powerful effect. A friend of mine has a bumper sticker on her car that says, "The labor movement, the people that brought you the weekend." And winning the 40-hour week and ending child labor was a huge struggle that civil resistance was used. We're just recently, last weekend in the United States was the holiday for Martin Luther King's birthday, and the civil rights movement explicitly and very self-consciously used civil resistance. United Farm Workers did with the strike and boycott. It was true in the anti-Vietnam War. The anti-nuclear movement used it to keep the number of nuclear power plants very low compared to the 1,000 that were originally projected for the United States. ACT UP, an organization of gays and lesbians who were, and their supporters who were focusing particularly around the AIDS epidemic and getting AIDS research money and used civil resistance. Immigrant rights is another example, and that's an ongoing struggle in the United States. Movement for Black Lives is another good example. But it's also been used internationally, and so here's just a few. And on the left here, there's an ICNC film called Bringing Down a Dictator, which is a documentary about overthrowing Milosevic in Serbia in 2000. The color revolutions in Eastern Europe and Georgia's Rose Revolution in 2003 is a good example. Ukraine moving towards democracy using civil resistance in 2004, and then the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. Overthrowing a king in Nepal and establishing a much more democratic situation. And it's not a perfect society with everything solved, but it opened up a democratic opportunity and move things forward. Tunisia and the organizing there, helping spark an Arab Spring. and it had mixed outcomes in various countries, but in Tunisia, it did create a more democratic opening. And then more recently, Sudan's nonviolent revolution, which is an ongoing struggle and working out at this point, now that the dictator's been overthrown, working out a collaborative and negotiated, and so peace building, moving into a phase of peace building and institution building to create a transition government. So I just wanted to show that it's sort of frequent, it's all over the world. There are mixed outcomes, but many successes. And so let's get into the record of civil resistance effectiveness. So ICNC had a hand in what's become a very powerful and influential book on the comparative effectiveness between armed struggle and civil resistance that was written by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stevens. Now, Maria Stevens now works at the United States Institute for Peace, but a few years back, she was working with ICNC, who had an academic workshop to train and engage faculty, I think largely in the US in that particular workshop, though we do workshops around the world, bringing faculty and graduate students together to think about how to do more pedagogy around civil resistance. And Erica Chenoweth was a PhD student at the time, and her interest was in violent struggle and terrorism to overthrow oppressive regimes. But she was interested in repression, and so she came, and these, Maria and Erica ended up being roommates for this, I think, a 4 or 5 day workshop. And they debated late into the night, where Erica would say, well, I appreciate, these case studies that you're showing, but I think I could look, and for every case study of successful nonviolent revolution, I could show you a failed outcome for such a campaign, and I could show you successful outcomes for violent campaigns. And so they got to talking, they talked with the leadership of ICNC, and the idea was there to start a major study and create a database that would look at all campaigns, whether they were violent or civil resistance, from 1900 to 2006, that met the requirements of being what they called maximalist changes. Like, these are the hardest cases, major sort of changes in a regime, often with very, very violent opposition. So it was anti-colonial struggles, overthrowing dictators, or self-determination, sort of successionist movements. And so they developed the database with some financial support from ICNC, and then eventually published their results. And their book, I think in 2011, won the American Political Science Association Award. And so it was really, their methodology was looked at really clearly. So what were their findings? It turned out it sort of changed Erica's entire view, because the findings were very different from what she expected or conventional political science thought would be. And this is something that I think is very valuable to bring into peace studies and peace and conflict studies. So the first thing was that they looked at 323 violent and nonviolent resistance campaigns from this period of 1900 to 2006. And what they found is that non-democratic rule would, the overthrowing that and creating more democratic openings, nonviolent resistance, nonviolent civil resistance campaigns achieved success 53% of the time, compared with only 26% for nonviolent resistance campaigns. And so this was the first sort of big and quantitative study that had been done comparing not just individual cases, but looking at many cases. And this is a pretty significant finding, but they found other things as well. And this is just a graphical form, which I think is impressive of the first finding. But then let's look at this. They looked at the probability that a country that had one of these campaigns would become, at least a limited democracy 5 years after the campaign. And the different success rates between violent and nonviolent is just shocking in terms of having more democratic outcomes. And there's sort of a logical reason. Civil resistance depends on participation, voluntary coordination and collaboration of many different constituencies working together in dealing with an undemocratic elite. And so that it's just a dynamic that lends itself more to democratic outcomes and teaching democratic skills. An interesting thing is failed campaigns are still more likely to achieve a democracy 5 years after the campaign, because even if the campaign fails, in the process of trying to win it, people are learning many lessons, they're building coalitions, and they're learning how to work together and trust each other and build participation. Another thing that I think is very important for the peace studies field is to realize that civil resistance campaigns compared to nonviolent campaigns is that nonviolent campaigns dramatically decrease the chances of the country will experience a civil war within the 10 years after the campaign. 28% is still fairly high though, and so more work is needed to be done to think about how to make that even more successful. The other thing they discovered as they were doing this work is that the onset of civil resistance campaigns has been increasing, that there's been a trend away from armed campaigns over that century and an increasingly amount of people trying to win rights, freedom, and justice through civil resistance, which suggests that that's one reason that this is an important field to study if your peace studies program is not looking at alternative forms of conflict as part of its overall view. The other thing is that a lot of arguments among activists is once repression starts, then you have to engage in violent action to defend a community. But this is from a different study. It's from a monograph by Jonathan Pickney that was published by ICNC. And it looked at many different campaigns as sort of a different and more recent database set, but they found that the percentage of violent repression was much higher when movements engaged in violent tactics. So not only is it more successful to use civil resistance, it defends people better in that it cuts down the amount of attacks by a ruling elite. And this is another study by Erica Chenoweth and Evan Perkowski that was looking at mass killings in response to violent movement campaigns or nonviolent movement campaigns. And it was a pretty startling determination of how that, again, that in the face of civil resistance campaign, that limits the capacity of a brutal undemocratic state from engaging in a significant repression. It doesn't mean it disappears, but it's mitigated quite a bit. And so that's a pretty profound finding. So in the last few minutes here, 6 or 7 minutes, I want to just talk about how can ICNC civil resistance resources help peace and conflict studies educators. And as the manager of academic initiatives, this is one of the great joys in my life, that we can work as a global educational foundation and with our primary focus in the academic side of the house on scholars, educators, and students. And so our academic initiatives have three main components: supporting education, supporting publications, and supporting research. So let's just walk through some of these. So some of the educational programs is ICNC annually does several online courses, usually about 60 people from over 30 countries around the world. We've often had faculty who are trying to create greater depth and background in civil resistance take these, but it's a mix of sort of activists, academics, various kinds of students who are trying to learn that. Similarly, we run regional institutes, one in Eastern Europe, one in South Asia and Nepal, and then we do one in the Americas in Quito. And so these are some of the resources we have available, and I can go into more detail in Q&A, and I also can hear as we have a moderated online course with several scholars in the field working with this. We also do a participant-led course that's sort of well-designed by ICNC, and but we don't provide moderators because we don't have the bandwidth. But we do a lot of evaluation on what are the learning gains by people in the course evaluation, and we're finding this successful. And this year we'll probably start a series of self-paced individualized courses that it's not just you apply for it, but you can just register for these. So we're working on expanding these. And this can be used in various ways by peace educators. When they can take the courses themselves, they can recommend them to students. Some faculty have integrated these courses as part of their own course design as a way to allow their students to have conversations with people all over the world around these important topics. The regional institutions I've mentioned on both the study and practice of strategic nonviolent action in Ecuador, Ukraine, and Nepal. And as funding permits, we want to expand these. These are face-to-face gatherings, usually 5 or 6 days, that involved activists, but also students and scholars and faculty. Curriculum fellowships, I'm really excited about this. Say at your program, there's not currently much coursework on civil resistance, is that we put out a call for people who make applications to become our curriculum fellows, where they're going to be designing a course that will include at least a core component on civil resistance. And we provide some funding and a lot of resources and some back and forth. So we help support classroom-based courses, online courses, and some blended courses. And so we're doing that all over the world. Usually have almost a dozen a year of different people. And we also pick people who are not just going to do a one-off, but they're seeing this as sort of seed money to help them in the next step of institutionalizing this at their institution. And so some courses have been brought in, institutionalized. It's often built up and sometimes into expanded programs as well. Also for the curriculum fellows, but anyone else, you can sign up for free to our academic online curriculum. And it has like 42 sections in 6 broad categories, which are listed here, with lots of resources, videos, webinars, readings, and things. We also have a resource library that's pretty extensive on our website that people can do research or find readings for their courses, and other resources, including websites and documentaries. in the resource library, we're doing more and more translations, and we now have many of the resources in over 70 different languages. So you can search by language, which we find has been really helpful. And we find that with curriculum fellows in certain countries, they can get a number of their readings in the language that's appropriate for the country they're teaching. We also have documentaries. I mentioned Bringing Down a Dictator, but we have a lot of these that are available to freely stream, and a lot of educators use different segments of these in their courses, either showing them in class for discussions or assigning them outside of class as part of the prep and homework. We have publications, a monograph series, and special reports. We've already seen some examples. A couple years ago, we started the Minds in the Movement blog, which you can search by author and by topic, and you can often find short readings or things where your students can do research, and we do occasional manuals and books. Right now, we're working with a couple academics who are also activists on a sort of a training manual on how to deal with agents provocateurs, who are sort of paid government agents who infiltrate movements and try to damage the movements, often by breaking down nonviolent discipline and making it easier to repress the movements. And so here's just some more examples in the monographs, special reports, a look at the blog. And then in the research, a very important one is that every year we do a call internationally for doctoral and junior faculty who are doing research that will be researched and then tried to be published in peer-reviewed academic journals as a way to help build the field and build the research and extend, not just by doing publications of our own, but extend into the institutionalized academic journal system that can be very helpful. We also currently have calls for rapid field research and also for researching material resources for civil resistance movements. So there are specified calls, and we can talk more about this in terms of our research priorities and things, but this is a way that we can support academic research for people in the peace studies field. And with that, I think I did reasonably good on not going too far over time.
You did fabulously, Steve.
And we can do questions and comments.
Yeah, so great. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Steve, for being willing to share all these amazing resources. I know I've been taking a lot of notes, and so we could share those with our faculty. One thing I do want to mention before we start with questions is that this webinar will be archived on the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network webpage. You'll be able to access this one and the prior ones that have been, that we've had in 2019. And you'll be able to access, we have quite a few coming up here this spring through the summer, and you'll be able to see those right from the webpage if you click on resources and then the webinar series. So what we'd like to do, since we have Chris and JF Zimmer on, with this small number, I might just ask to see first if Chris has any questions, and then we'll go to JF Zimmer. Just be sure that you take your, make sure you unmute yourself, because you're both on mute right now. And I do want to share that this is recorded and that, again, it will be archived. Thank you. Chris, what questions do you have for Steve? Or comments?
Well, first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was really wonderful to see the vast amount of resources available, and the way that you organized it was very efficient, I think. A question I have is that Hawaiian homeland nationalism is really taking a stronger and stronger hold these days, because I think, as all the research shows, that people are wanting to move towards nonviolent resistance, and the Hawaiian way is Ho'oponopono. And I was
Mhm.
wondering if you have any resources on that that I can then use on our website and stuff. Just question, yes?
That's an excellent question. We have, we're currently working with a curriculum fellow who is developing a course in Hawaii. So if you send me an email at this email, I could forward on to that person and they could maybe talk with you, because she has looked at our resources and adapted them, but she's also found, you know, more specialized things with case studies in the area. So I think, given that we're international, there's areas that we do really well, and then there's things that we haven't even touched yet. And so, as a student of mine from Africa, when he came to North America and studied with me when I taught at an activist training master's program through Antioch University, I said, well, you know, this is sort of US based. Is that appropriate for you? And he said, well, I come to adapt, not to adopt. And so, but this curriculum fellow found resources that worked for her, but also then found some things that we didn't even have in our database. And so when she turns in her deliverables and her course design, that's one of the ways that we find new materials to add to our resource library or other things. So I hope that answers your question, that, you know, we definitely have some things, but we also like to hear from people around the world about other things that we could add as resources and how our programs can better serve people all over.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Chris, if you have another question, we have time for that, and then I'll follow up with a couple of things as well.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, you say that you have someone in the field in Hawaii working on this? Okay, because do you know if they're on the Big Island and the Big Telescope confrontation that's happening now? The international community wants to build that big telescope on the mountain, and the Hawaiian nationals have been resisting peacefully, but it's becoming more violent in the term of the states and international, you know, push, because it's big money.
Right. And so that I do remember is part of sort of the case study she's using in the course. So I think she would have some material. And these are challenging things that, you in when there's these big power differentials where you don't even have enough power that you're going to get into negotiations, or the negotiations are set up to just sort of occupy people's time but not resolve important issues. That's an example of where using civil resistance can be really important. But it's also very challenging understanding what are the strategic ways to engage in this fight to increase the chances of success. And there's debates within movements, and even if, you know, we can say that there's a lot of good research to suggest that the more you can maintain high levels of participation, and nonviolent civil resistance does a much better job, often by, you know, a factor of 3 times as large mass participation in these struggles. And when movements start getting violent, it often minimizes the number of people that will come out or the types of people that will come out. And so there's just these very tough real world challenges, but learning from other people in case studies, and looking at sort of the strategic dynamics and understanding them can be really helpful. And that was one of the reasons that this woman applied to our curriculum fellowship program, to spread that knowledge more widely and with more depth.
Well, you know, it's interesting. In one of the slides you had about how even if the resistance movement wasn't, quote, successful, that there was this very positive outcome. And what I can see on the island so far, it's difficult because Hawaii is a collection of islands. So water separates people.
Right.
But what's interesting is even if we lose the telescope debate, it is unifying people from the islands. And what I think they're going to get is more than they ask for, because this homeland push is going to get even bigger and stronger and louder. And so maybe, you know, the universe has a plan and maybe this is just a way to get organized people, you know, more strongly and push for what's really important.
Yeah, and if you have some, you know, knowledge of the movement and participant observation and things like that, that would be a good example of going onto our website, going to the Minds of the Movement blog, reading the submission guidelines, and submitting something to our editor, because we try to keep up with really creative examples of ongoing campaigns that people are doing. So that's you know, 800 to 1,000 words with some pictures can help spread the knowledge of what people are learning from a particular struggle. So that would be an example of sort of the back and forth way. It's not just a situation where we have a bunch of resources and people can tap, is that we're constantly learning from other people and
So let's go to the
their
ICNC
work
website, right?
and making that available to people.
Do you want to show, Steve, where it is exactly on the webpage? Would you like to do that?
Sure, I think this is going to click through and work. Let's see if it does. Okay, so this is our website. Oops. So you can go down and you can get some new information.
So Steve, at least on my end, it just looks like a black screen.
It's just a black screen.
Okay. So maybe you
It
need
just
to
looks like a black screen. I don't know what to do.
close your PowerPoint and go ahead and go in through like Google Chrome or one of your browsers.
Okay, so let's see if I can do that easily. Stop share.
There you go.
Okay, and then let's see. And then I'll close this. Oh, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties.
Oh, it's all right. I thought we have some time here, and if you'd like to show it, then it makes it a lot easier to then remember how to get there.
Oh, definitely. I'm technically challenged too, so I love it.
There we go. Okay, so
share your screen again.
So share my screen again and we'll see what happens. Yes, I think this is going to work. All right, can people see it now?
There we go.
Yes,
yes.
Great. So this is our home page, and there's various kinds of information. You can click here if you're scholars and students, but we have information sort of curated for the policy community, for activists and organizers, and you can get right here, you can go to Minds of the Movement blog. And so this is the blog here, and so there's always the lead story, and then there's the most recent stories behind this. And then if you go to the top, you can go to the articles. There's thematic series here, and you can go to the articles by those things, and you can also do it by contributors. But right here is submission guidelines, and then this is how you could contact the editor.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that I think would be a really interesting struggle. I mean, and you also can search. We may have something that I haven't seen yet on that struggle, but there's, as you can just see from these sort of topped ones, it goes sort of all over different kinds of struggles in different places.
And this is
but
so important.
really analyzing them for theoretical insight and practical strategic lessons. We really try to balance the needs of sort of academics and activists, as well as people who try to, you know, play both roles in their life.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Sure.
Great. Well,
Any other questions?
Any other questions, Chris? And then I think I'm going to switch over to the OPCSN webpage.
No, I'm good. I got a lot to think about and do now, and a lot of resources. Thank you.
Okay. And I can just show you quickly here this is where you can get to more information about various programs, and including calls on for applications and proposals about what we're currently doing. This is the resource library where you can do English language, but you can also go to the translated resources, and it's also where you can pick up the films for live streaming. But let's just do translated resources. So these are all the languages that we have some resources in translation.
That's amazing, Steve.
We're really pretty pleased with this, and a lot of people use this. We also have various conflicts sort of summaries that a lot of people use, and it's a case study. But the resource library also takes you to many things beyond what our ICNC generated. I think one good example, let's see if I can just find it quickly. It's always on the fly, but USIP, the United States Institute for Peace, did a manual, sort of a training manual on synthesizing nonviolent action and peace building, and they call it the SNAP manual. And it includes sort of theoretical commentary, but it also includes exercises that you could use with your students to help think through both the integration of both civil resistance, because I mostly focused on what's often missing. And it doesn't look like anything came up, which is too bad. I'm sure it's in there.
What do you think is always missing?
Say what?
What do you think is always missing?
Oh, in my experience, some peace and conflict studies actually integrate civil resistance quite well. But often there's sort of an imbalance where it's not, you know, there's not a focus on civil resistance and peacekeeping skills, or how they integrate and work together. So I think everybody in peace studies would be wise to sort of do an internal review of their curriculum and see, is it balanced? Where could it be strengthened? Okay. And our primary sort of resources that are valuable would be for people who are trying to increase the focus and the skills and resources around civil resistance in their program. So I focused on that. There are probably some programs that are more focused on civil resistance and don't pay enough attention to peace building or the integration of those. So it sort of depends on what your institution is starting from. I was taking the assumption that this webinar is probably most valuable for people who their programs are weak on civil resistance and they're wondering how to make that more robust and integrate it more with peace building skills. All right, it looks like you changed the sharing on that, Jen. And
so we thank you so much, Steve, and thank you so much, Chris, for all of your good questions. I think it was really helpful, Steve, for you to share where people could find things on the webpage. I did want to, before we close here, share a little bit about where we could find this archived webinar as well as future webinars. But before I do that, Steve, would you like to share some parting comments or thoughts for the group, or
thank you.
Something?
Well, I remember when I went to a conference that Jen organized in Ohio and did a version of this talk, but I had a lot more time. It was like an hour and a half, so I did a presentation for close to 50 minutes. And so for this purposes, I cut out my opening story that I think illustrates the challenge before us. And last year, I discovered a series of articles in the New York Times, historic, from, I guess it would have been 1934, when a Quaker religion professor had been invited to be the keynote speaker at the sort of North American conference of rabbis in North America, mostly US. And so think about it, it's 1933 or 34, rise of fascism in Europe and somewhat around the world, and a virulent anti-Semitic version of fascism emerging in Germany. And so Henry Cadbury, the Quaker, was explicitly saying, well, we have to love our enemy. We can't engage in any kind of resistance. All we can do is dialogue. He critiqued the whole notion that was popular back then of how to do some sanctions and divestment from German companies and boycotting German goods as a way to put pressure on the German regime to not go as far as they did. And he was all against that. He explicitly was critiquing, sort of Gandhian resistance. And he was talking about the path of non-resistance. And so he was wanting it to limit all these Jewish leaders to dialogue, diplomacy, constant expressions of goodwill towards the members of the German Nazi regime. And he was saying we shouldn't engage in civil resistance, nonviolent resistance. And what I found so interesting is he was just rejected by the rabbis at the time. And one person stood up at the podium right after he talked and said, I do not subscribe to non-resistance. We have to find effective and ethical ways to fight for justice and fight against the rampant anti-Semitism that's emerging in Germany. And this became a huge debate. And the next day, the group of rabbis passed a resolution that said, while diplomacy, negotiations, and various kinds of peacekeeping things are important, they said we also need to support nonviolent resistance to defend the rights of people. And so I'm a Quaker in my own faith tradition, but as I thought about it, I'm going, I really disagree with the Quaker in this, and I stand with the rabbis that we need both peace building and civil resistance. And so I use that as just as a story that I think that anybody who's in a peace studies program that sort of stands with Hedreen Cadbury about, well, we just need to be all about collaboration, cooperation, dialogue, diplomacy, and we would never engage in conflict. We would never engage in resistance. I would encourage them to rethink that position and probably stand with the bigger position, the more inclusive position of the rabbis facing really dire circumstances and trying to come up with creative responses. So I'll end with that story because I just think it's a powerful one about where do we stand.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thanks again to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict for partnering with Ohio colleges and universities over the years. We thank ICNC too for providing speakers at conferences and also training. So one of the things that other states might be interested in checking in with ICNC about is not only inviting them to speak at conferences, but in addition to that, ICNC has came out and did a one-day training for us before for faculty from colleges and universities across the state and anyone else who wanted to travel to Ohio. It was free, and they could learn about how to integrate these concepts into their courses and receive some of those great free materials that Steve mentioned. So maybe that's an opportunity. You might want to reach out to ICNC in addition to the great resources that Steve already shared. So thank you. I do want to share, but as we close here, because it is 2 o'clock, is to click on resources here at the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network webpage, and you'll see that you'll find a number of different resources, including the webinars. And I just wanted to share where these are so that you can access them. So this is the list of some that we started in 2019. And as you go down, you'll see some of them that are scheduled here coming up in 2020. And if you click there on the resources with the webinars, you're going to see the full list of webinars here. So the ones that are coming up, like tomorrow, include developing a peace and conflict studies program using multidisciplinary courses, and then the place of dialogue in peace and conflict studies, and additional content areas. So in addition to working with our partners like ICNC, the colleges and universities from across the state of Ohio share their specialty on these webinars, such as at Bluffton College, where on March 12th in 2020, the Line and Land Peace Arts Center will share about teaching peace through literature. They have a special peace library that they have for children and for teachers. And so they'll share some of those strategies with us in March. So thank you so much again, Steve. Thanks for joining us, Chris. And this is where you'll be able to find the archived webinars.
It's a wonderful resource. Thank you so much, Jen. It was a real pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. Bye, Steve.
Thank you.
Bye, Chris.